He had already lived the victory 1,000 different ways, not as a hope, not as a dream, but as a quiet certainty that sat behind his eyes like a second sun. Yhwach stood at the summit of his dominion, with the stillness of a monarch who did not need to prove he was king. The air itself seemed to wait for his permission to move. In every world he had touched, history became a corridor that narrowed toward him. Choices, rebellions, prayers, betrayals, they all folded inward until they served a single conclusion. His name did not need to be shouted. Fate did the announcing. His shadow was long because time itself leaned away from him. Then he opened the Almighty. It was not sight like mortal sight. It was a revelation that did not arrive in pieces. It arrived whole. Futures layered over futures, branching and interlocking, each one a thread in a tapestry that only he could read. He did not merely witness them, he selected them. He discarded the futures that displeased him the way a man discards ash from a sleeve. In the river of possibility, he was not a swimmer. He was the riverbed. He saw an empire of silence where all opposition ended before it began. He saw the last defiance of enemies that believed in miracles, their miracles snuffed out by inevitability. He saw the surrender of chance itself, a universe that finally accepted the truth it had tried to deny, that there was no freedom, only ignorance of the ending. And yet, among those countless inevitable victories, there was one vision that did not obey him. At first, it appeared as a flaw in the pattern, a flicker where the future should have been sharp, a black seam running through the fabric. He turned his attention toward it the way a predator turns its head when the forest goes quiet. The seam widened. Where he should have seen branching outcomes, he saw a fracture, not a choice, not a divergence, a break, a place where destiny did not merely turn. It shattered, as if the concept of tomorrow had struck a wall and split into dust. He reached for it, with the effortless command of a god who had never been denied. He attempted to select a future where the fracture did not exist. Nothing changed. He attempted to select a future where the fracture became his advantage. Still nothing. A rare sensation moved through him. Not fear, because fear belonged to those who believed they could lose. This was something colder, recognition, the feeling of meeting a law older than his rule. In that impossible vision, there was a sky without stars. There were oceans of color that bled into one another, like bruises across the face of reality. There were screams without lungs, prayers without gods, and laughter that tasted like rust. He saw titanic shapes moving beneath the surface of that nightmare space, as if the void itself had organs, and those organs were dreaming. He had seen realms of spirit and void before. This was neither. This was a wound. The fracture became a mouth. The Almighty showed him a future in which he was not the author. It showed him a future where his name did not matter, where his authority did not reach, where the very idea of a single timeline was an insult to the nature of that place. The future did not branch there. It rotted. For the first time, he could not see the ending as his. For the first time, tomorrow did not kneel. The fracture pulled. There was no warning, no gradual unraveling. One instant he stood as the center of all horizons, and the next, the horizons were gone. Light and meaning tore away like cloth caught in a machine. The futures he had held so easily became slippery, then distant, then inaccessible, as if a door had slammed shut between him and the concept of possibility itself. He felt his connection to the totality of outcomes stretch thin, like a thread drawn toward a blade. Then it snapped. The world fell away, and he fell into something that was not space. It was the warp. At first, it was sensation without shape. Pressure from all directions, a vast ocean where thought became current and emotion became weather. Colors that had no names rippled through him. Sound existed as taste. Time was not a line but a storm. He could feel the presence of minds, not individual minds, but populations, billions of lives burning and dying and hoping and screaming across a distant galaxy. Their anguish and devotion leaked into this place like blood into water. It was not a realm that existed beside reality. It was reality's reflection, distorted by the souls of everything that lived. Yhwach did not struggle. Struggle implied uncertainty, he observed. The Almighty tried to open again, not as an act of will but as a reflex, the way a heart beats. Futures flickered, but they did not align. They overlapped like broken glass. Every attempt to grasp a clean branch resulted in a dozen contradictory visions. a warship exploding and not exploding, a planet burning and thriving, a man praying and murdering, a god dying and being born in the same moment. The future here was not a tapestry, it was a battlefield. He understood, with the clarity of a king who had conquered systems of belief, that this place was built on contradiction. It fed on the very thing he had always subdued, chaos not as randomness, but as self-sustaining paradox. A universe that did not worship destiny as a straight road, but as an altar where inevitability was preached while madness wrote the scripture. Yet, even here, in this ocean of insanity, he remained himself. His presence was a pillar of stillness in a sea of noise. Where he drifted, the currents shifted, subtly at first, as if the warp resented him, as if it tasted his certainty and recoiled. Whispers pressed against him from every direction, curious, hungry, ancient. They did not speak in words. They pressed visions into his mind, a throne of skulls, wet with eternal violence, a garden of rot, where laughter bubbled from pus, a palace of indulgence, every pleasure sharpened into a blade, a labyrinth of schemes that folded into itself endlessly, a serpent eating its own future. The warp did not present these as invitations. It presented them as tests, as if the ocean itself wished to know what kind of creature had fallen into it. Yhwach's gaze remained calm. He had met gods before. He had killed gods and replaced them with his own certainty. The difference here was scale and texture. These were not monarchs sitting above reality. These were storms made intelligent by worship and terror. They were not separate beings so much as gravitational fields, pulling all thought toward their nature. And still, he was not tempted. Temptation required an emptiness. Yhwach was full. What he felt instead was assessment. A king judging other kings and finding them loud. The Almighty continued to stutter, but he began to read the stutter like a language. Not perfect foresight, but a map of tendencies. The warp was not without patterns. It was simply ruled by patterns written in emotion rather than law. Violence thickened certain currents. Despair stabilized others. Ambition made loops. Pleasure became traps. He could not command it the way he commanded a clean timeline, but he could understand it, and understanding was the first step toward dominion. He extended his will, not to seize control of the warp, but to declare himself within it. The declaration was not a shout. It was an inevitability, a statement of identity that did not ask permission. "I am the one who chooses tomorrow," the warp answered. Not with words, but with pressure. A tightening around his soul, as if the ocean had realized it was holding something that refused to drown. The colors deepened. The currents twisted. Shapes began to form from the storm. Faces and claws and wings, all born from the same substance, all reaching for him with the hunger of things that sensed a new kind of prey. But Yhwach did not feel preyed upon. He felt noticed. And somewhere beyond the warp's endless howl, beyond the screaming choir of living minds, he perceived a distant physical galaxy, a place of cold stars and iron empires, a place where men built cathedrals out of warships and prayed to an undead monarch on a throne of machinery, a place where faith was used like a weapon because reality was too cruel to face without it, the Imperium of man. He did not know its name yet, but he felt its weight, a civilization so vast that even its ignorance had gravity. Billions kneeling, billions dying. A universe that claimed inevitability as doctrine, while drowning in chaos it could not admit it had created. Yhwach's lips barely moved, but the thought was sharp. A universe that worships destiny, yet cannot see it. The warp surged again, demonic shapes closing in, the first teeth of the new world baring themselves. Yhwach remained motionless, as a king at the beginning of a war he had not yet decided to win. They came as a ring of hunger, orbiting him like carrion birds that had found a corpse that did not rot. Demons, born from nightmares and prayer, swam through the warp with the confidence of creatures that believed this place belonged to them. Some were little more than claws and masks, their bodies made of shrieking color. Others wore crude mockeries of armor, as if they had learned the idea of war from the minds of soldiers and decided to imitate it. They watched him with eyes that did not match, eyes that belonged to different fears stitched together. A lesser soul would have been torn apart simply by being seen. In the warp, attention was pressure. Recognition was predation. Yhwach endured it as if it were weather. He did not draw a blade. He did not speak a command. He simply looked back, and the ring tightened, uncertain. Demons understood instincts. They understood dominance. This presence did not taste like panic or devotion. It tasted like certainty. One demon, thin as a shadow, moved closer. It had too many hands, and each hand held a different symbol: a crown, a quill, a dagger, a key. Its smile widened with every contradiction. It spoke without sound, filling his mind with a whisper that tried to sound clever. "You see tomorrow, little king, then see this. See that nothing ends. See that every future is a joke." The whisper carried an underlying pattern: curiosity wrapped around arrogance, a desire to be proven right, a hunger not just to consume, but to outthink. See, not a name spoken, but a flavor in the warp, the taste of schemes and shifting outcomes. Yhwach felt the greater presence behind the demon, vast and amused, like an entire storm leaning close to inspect a single drop of rain. He let the Almighty open again, carefully. Futures fractured, but within the fracture he found something, a rhythm, a tendency. Every time this demon approached, certain outcomes clustered, not because fate was clean, but because ambition always tried to become the center. He understood. This was not a god of prophecy. This was a god of wanting prophecy to be wrong. Across the ring, another presence pushed forward, heavy and wet. A demon that looked like a bloated saint, its skin split with laughing sores. It smelled of sweet rot, even in a place where smell was memory. It did not threaten. It welcomed. "Poor king," it murmured into him. "You must be tired. Come. Stop fighting. Let it all decay into peace. Everything ends the same way, softened by time." Nurgle. The warp around it thickened, as if despair had become syrup. This presence was not about winning. It was about surrender disguised as comfort. The kind of comfort offered to a man on a battlefield who has lost too much to believe in sunrise. Yhwach felt the trick. In his own universe, despair was a tool. Here, despair was a religion. He did not reject it with anger. He simply did not need it. A third pressure entered the ring like an axe entering flesh. The demons nearest it split apart, not from fear, but from instinctive obedience. The air in the warp tightened, all motion becoming straight lines toward violence. Something massive approached, a figure made of muscle and rage, its eyes red pits, its body a promise of impact. It did not speak. It did not need to. Its intent was pure. Khorne, the god of war, did not tempt with ideas. It tempted with simplicity. Swing. Kill. Prove. It offered the relief of being an animal in a universe that made thinking unbearable. The figure raised its weapon, an impossibly large blade that was more concept than metal. Around it, futures flickered where Yhwach was split in two, where he was crushed, where he was torn and consumed. Yhwach watched those futures with calm. He watched them, then he selected a different cluster. Not a clean victory, but an outcome where the strike did not land, because the strike was never fully committed in the first place. Rage wanted impact, but rage also wanted acknowledgement. Yhwach's voice was quiet, almost tired. "You are loud." The ring trembled. The massive figure hesitated, if only for a fraction, offended by the lack of reverence. That fraction mattered. Then came the fourth presence, the one that arrived like perfume in a slaughterhouse. It did not shove. It drifted. It was close before it was seen. Demons near it shivered with pleasure and pain, unable to tell the difference. A figure formed, beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful. Its smile was understanding. Its gaze promised that whatever emptiness Yhwach carried, it could be filled. Slaanesh. It offered not domination, but indulgence, not victory, but sensation, not control, but the illusion that control was unnecessary if you could just feel enough. The whisper slid into him, intimate, almost kind. "You carry a crown like a wound. Put it down. Let the universe touch you. Let something else decide for once." For a heartbeat, the warp waited. The gods leaned in through their lesser mouths, each curious in its own way. Would this man who saw every future finally meet something he wanted more than certainty? Yhwach looked at the ring and saw them as they were, not as ultimate truths, but as reflections of a galaxy in agony. They were the shadows cast by humanity's extremes: war, decay, ambition, excess. If the galaxy ever healed, these storms would starve. He found the thought almost amusing. "You are not gods," he said, voice still quiet. "You are symptoms." The demons recoiled, not because the words hurt, but because the certainty behind them was foreign. The warp was built to drown souls in desire. Yhwach's soul did not float. It stood. Sainkes' presence shifted, intrigued. It tasted possibility. A rival in a realm where rivalry was nourishment. Nurgle's presence chuckled, a bubbling sound, as if rot itself found the stubbornness charming. Khorne's pressure increased, anger sharpening. It did not like being analyzed. It liked being obeyed. Slaanesh smiled wider, delighted by resistance, because resistance made the eventual surrender sweeter, or so it believed. Yhwach did not attack. He did not need to. His power was not to swing harder. His power was to decide which swings mattered. The Almighty continued to cough up futures like broken mirrors, but Yhwach learned to read which shards carried weight. In the warp, outcomes were not decided by physics. They were decided by narrative, by belief, by the momentum of collective emotion. And belief, he knew, could be conquered. He reached outward, not to seize the Chaos Gods, but to map them, to feel the shape of their influence in the distant galaxy. Where were their cults blooming? Where did war feed Khorne? Where did hopeless worlds ferment Nurgle? Where did intrigue turn empires into labyrinths for Tzeentch? Where did pleasure turn into obsession for Slaanesh? The galaxy lit up in his mind, a grim constellation of suffering. He found a planet under siege, a world praying for salvation with the same desperation that birthed monsters. An imperial world, its defenses cracking, its sky torn open by warp storms. A thin path of probability led there. Not certain, but available. Yhwach stepped toward it. Demons lunged. Claws raked at him. Teeth made of screaming prayers tried to bite his soul. In the futures where they succeeded, they feasted. In the futures he allowed, their claws slipped as if the universe had decided their grip was weak. He moved through them without haste, a king walking through a crowd that could not touch him because the crowd did not exist in the version of tomorrow he permitted. The warp screamed around him, offended. Tzeentch watched, delighted. Khorne roared, furious. Nurgle sighed, amused. Slaanesh whispered, curious. And Yhwach, untempted, unhurried, carried his certainty out of the ocean of madness toward the cold, war-torn stars. The first thing that greeted him was smoke. Not the mystical smoke of incense, but the choking, practical smoke of burned cities and ruptured fuel lines. Yhwach emerged into real space, like a blade sliding from water. The sky above was a cracked ceiling of ash-grey cloud, lit by distant fires that pulsed like dying hearts. An imperial world, though he did not yet know the name of the empire that owned it. He felt it immediately in the architecture. Massive, brutal, devotional. Cathedrals built into bunkers. Statues of armored saints holding rifles like relics. Everything designed to remind the living that they were small, and that their only virtue was obedience. The ground shook with artillery. Somewhere beyond the ruined skyline, a front line was collapsing. He stood in the open, a lone figure on a blasted avenue, rubble piled like grave mounds on either side. Shattered stained glass glittered under his feet, saints broken into sharp fragments. The wind carried prayers from hiding places. Civilians huddled in basements, whispering names of gods they did not understand, begging the sky for a miracle. The miracle arrived, and it did not smile. A scream rose from the horizon, not human, not mechanical, a war cry that carried warp distortion in its echo. Demons were already here. The world was under siege by chaos, reality fraying at the edges where terror and devotion had grown too intense. Yhwach lifted his gaze. He could see the battle without moving, not by eyesight alone, but by the way probability bent around conflict. He felt the weight of dying soldiers, the recoil of guns, the panic of commanders watching their lines buckle. He sensed where the next shell would land before the shell was fired, because the intention was already present. To the soldiers, war was a storm. To Yhwach, war was a script. He opened the Almighty. This time, the futures in real space were cleaner. Not perfect, because the warp still gnawed at the edges, but readable. He saw 1,000 variations of the next 10 minutes. He saw where the defenders broke, where they rallied, where a brave act delayed the inevitable by seconds. He saw the moments where heroes died, without changing anything. Then he selected. He did not need to shout orders. He did not need to lift a hand in grand display. He simply walked forward, and the future rearranged itself around his steps. A squad of Imperial infantry rounded a corner ahead, fleeing from something behind them. Their uniforms were ash-coated, their eyes wide, their hands trembling around rifles they no longer trusted. They saw him and froze, because in their world lone figures did not stand on streets during sieges unless they were mad or holy. Behind them, the thing that chased them burst into view. A demon, horned and thick, its body a knot of muscle and hate, dragging a cleaver that dripped with unreality. It bellowed, and the air vibrated, windows shattering in its wake. The soldiers fired. Lost beams struck the demon and evaporated against it, like rain. Their fear rose, thick and sweet, feeding the monster. The demon surged forward, cleaver lifting. In most futures, the next second was slaughter. Yhwach stepped slightly to the left. That was all. The demon's cleaver fell, but in the future he permitted, the angle was wrong. The blade bit into the broken pavement instead of flesh. The impact cracked the street, sending shards up. The soldiers stumbled back, not understanding why they were still alive. Yhwach looked at the demon as one looks at a stray dog. He did not strike it with brute force. He erased its victory. The Almighty shifted, and the demon's next motion became a mistake. Its roar became a choke. Its body flickered as the warp struggled to justify its existence in a future where it had not won. Then it collapsed, unraveling into smoke and screaming color, banished not by superior weaponry, but by the absence of a timeline where it succeeded. The soldiers stared, stunned. One dropped to his knees. Another crossed himself with shaking fingers. Their lips formed prayers without permission. Yhwach did not acknowledge them. He continued walking. Word spread in broken fragments, the way rumors spread in war. A silent figure in white. A man whose presence made demons falter. A stranger who did not bleed. Some called him an angel. Others called him a witch. A few, the ones who had seen how reality twisted near him, called him something worse. A certainty. At the front lines, Imperial defenses were collapsing under a tide of warp-born horrors. Trenches filled with corpses. Gun emplacements overheated until barrels glowed. Commissars screamed orders with pistols raised, executing the frightened to keep the rest in place. Then Yhwach arrived. He stepped over coils of barbed wire and shattered bodies as if he were walking through tall grass. The soldiers nearest him felt something shift, an intangible pressure that made their panic thin. Not hope. Hope was fragile. This was inevitability, heavy and reassuring in a terrifying way. A demon prince loomed ahead, towering, armored in jagged plates that looked forged from blasphemy. Its wings beat the air with hurricane force. It lifted a clawed hand and laughed, tasting the fear of thousands. It spoke in a voice like grinding chains. Kneel. In 100 futures, the soldiers knelt. In 100 more, they died standing. In a handful, the demon prince was delayed but not stopped. In almost all, the planet's defenses failed within hours. Yhwach watched them all, then chose a narrow line. The demon prince lunged. In the chosen future, its wing caught a gust at the wrong instant. A microshift, a subtle misalignment. The kind of accident that never mattered until it did. Its body tilted, its momentum carrying it past the precise angle needed to strike Yhwach. Yhwach lifted his hand and touched the air. Not the demon, the air. In that touch, he confirmed the future he wanted. The demon prince's claw passed through empty space. Its laughter faltered. It tried to correct, but correction required a future where it had the initiative. Yhwach had already taken it. The prince's armor cracked, as if struck by a force that did not exist. Its wings tore, not because of physical damage, but because the futures where they remained intact were denied. It howled, furious, trying to reassert itself through sheer will. But will was not enough here. It fell, slammed into the mud, and as it tried to rise, it began to dissolve, its form unraveling into the warp like a lie being exposed. The front line went silent, except for the distant rumble of guns. Imperial soldiers stared at the place where a demon prince had been. Then they stared at Yhwach. A commissar stepped forward, his coat torn, his eyes hard with the fanatic discipline of a man trained to fear mercy. He raised his pistol not at Yhwach, but in salute, or in threat. He could not decide which. In the commissar's mind, There were only two categories, loyal and heretic. Yhwach was neither. The commissar's mouth opened, perhaps to demand identification, perhaps to declare him a miracle of the emperor. But the words died, because in Yhwach's presence language felt smaller. Behind the lines, civilians began to emerge from ruins. They looked like ghosts, faces grey with dust, hands shaking. Mothers clutched children and stared at the silent figure as if staring too long might wake a nightmare. Some wept, some smiled, some bowed. Yhwach did not offer comfort. He did not offer kindness. He offered an ending. He walked through the war like a man walking through a room that was already clean in his mind. Battles shifted around him. Shells that would have landed on packed trenches instead exploded harmlessly in empty craters. A charge that would have broken morale instead stalled, confusion rippling through the enemy as their victories evaporated. To the Imperium, it was a miracle. To the demons, it was theft. To the civilians, it was salvation that felt like a knife. Because salvation arrived without mercy, and the price of survival was obedience to a presence that did not ask their consent. As the siege began to collapse, the defenders cheered, but their cheer was thin. It was not the roar of men who believed they had won through courage. It was the sound of men who had witnessed something beyond courage, something that made their faith feel almost childish. Yhwach paused atop a ridge of rubble and looked up at the war-torn sky. Somewhere beyond it, he could feel the greater Imperium, the empire that would not tolerate unknown gods, the empire that would demand that all miracles wear the emperor's face. He did not smile, but there was a quiet certainty in him. They will come. They arrived as law made flesh. First came the agents, quiet, efficient, already convinced. Then came the priests, loud, trembling with righteous fear. Then came the psychers, pale and chained, escorted like weapons too dangerous to trust. Finally came the Inquisition, a presence that did not need an army because it carried the authority to erase worlds. The war had ended, but the planet did not feel at peace. It felt like it was holding its breath. Yhwach stood within the ruins of what had once been a cathedral, its roof collapsed, its altar broken, its saints reduced to headless stone. The Imperium had tried to build divinity into architecture. War had reminded it that stone was still stone. A man in black armor approached, rosette of authority displayed like a threat. His eyes were cold. His voice was measured. You are an unknown entity. You wield powers consistent with the warp. By authority of the Holy Ordos, you will submit to examination. Behind him, priests of the ecclesiarchy murmured litanies, fingers clutching prayer beads, mouths tasting scripture like medicine. To them, the universe made sense only if everything fit into the emperor's story. Yhwach looked at them, and in their faces he saw what he had seen 1,000 times before. People clinging to belief, because belief was softer than truth. He did not move. The Inquisitor gestured, and the psychers were brought forward. They were sanctioned, marked by ritual scars and implants, their minds trained to touch the warp without drowning. They formed a circle, hands trembling, eyes rolling back as they reached outward. Their minds struck Yhwach and broke. It was not a dramatic explosion. It was worse. A quiet shattering. One psyker fell to his knees and began to sob, laughter and tears mixing, because he had seen too much at once. Another screamed and clawed at his own eyes, as if sight itself had become poison. A third simply went still, mouth open, pupils blank, mind gone somewhere it could not return from. The Inquisitor's expression tightened. He had expected resistance. He had not expected wait. Yhwach spoke, calm, almost bored. You tried to look into me. The Inquisitor's hand drifted toward his weapon. Priests gasped. The air thickened with tension, the kind that precedes executions and crusades. The ecclesiarch stepped forward, robes heavy with ornament, face flushed with righteous fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Yhwach. Blasphemy. Witchcraft. You stand on imperial soil, and you claim miracles not granted by the emperor. There is only one divine will. Yhwach's gaze did not sharpen. It did not need to. Divine will, he repeated softly. You mean ignorance given a crown? The priests recoiled as if struck. Some whispered prayers louder, desperate to drown out the sacrilege. The Inquisitor raised his hand, signaling restraint, because he understood something the priests did not. If this being was a warp entity of unusual power, Open violence could escalate into catastrophe. But the ecclesiarchy did not understand caution. It understood purity. The priest continued, voice rising. You will kneel. You will confess. You will submit. The emperor protects. Yhwach looked at the broken cathedral around them. He looked at the rubble that had once been holy. He looked at the soot-stained icons that had not protected anyone. Then he looked back at the priest. Faith is a crutch for those who cannot see tomorrow. Silence fell like ash. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. In that moment, his mind raced through categories. Demon, heretic, xenos, rogue psyker, false prophets. None fit cleanly. The Imperium loved labels because labels made extermination easier. Yhwach did not offer them that ease. The Inquisitor spoke again, voice lower. If you are not corrupted, then what are you? Yhwach answered with the simplest truth. A king. That word carried weight that the warp itself seemed to recognize. The psykers on the ground twitched, whimpering, still haunted by the infinite visions they had tasted inside him. The Inquisitor stepped closer, trying to maintain control. This galaxy has a king. He sits on terror. His light guides mankind. If you claim kingship, you claim treason against all humanity. Yhwach's gaze drifted past them, as if looking at a distant star only he could see. Your king is a corpse sustained by worship. The priests erupted in outrage, voices overlapping in frantic condemnation. One drew a holy symbol like a weapon. Another fell to his knees, shaking as if the very statement had shaken the pillars of reality. The Inquisitor did not shout. He raised his voice just enough to cut through. Enough. His authority snapped the priests back into obedience. He turned his attention fully to Yhwach. You ended a siege that would have broken this world. You prevented a chaos incursion. That is not a small thing. The Imperium does not ignore such power. Yhwach said nothing. The Inquisitor continued, carefully. There are ways to serve. There are sanctioned roles. If you submit, if you bend your power to the Emperor's will, you will be protected. You will be used. Your existence can be made lawful. Yhwach's eyes remained calm, but the air seemed to tighten. Used. That was the Imperium's most honest word. It did not love its heroes. It spent them. Yhwach replied, voice still gentle. You mistake me for a tool. The Inquisitor's jaw tightened. Then, what do you want? The question carried more fear than anger. Because if this being wanted something incompatible with the Imperium, then the Imperium would do what it always did. It would burn. Yhwach considered the ruined cathedral again, the broken altar, the soot on the icons. I want the universe to stop lying to itself, he said. I want it cured. The priests heard heresy. The Inquisitor heard tyranny. Because to cure the Imperium was to remove the thing it depended on most. The comforting illusion that suffering had meaning because it was ordained. The Inquisitor's voice became colder. You will be judged. Yhwach's reply was quiet. I have already seen your judgment. At that, one of the surviving psykers began to laugh, a thin, horrified sound. He had seen it too. A cascade of futures, Inquisitors dying, planets burning, prayers unanswered. He laughed, because the only alternative was madness. The Inquisitor stepped back, mask of control cracking for the first time. In that crack, the Imperium revealed its true face. Not noble, not righteous, afraid. Afraid of anything it could not classify. Afraid of a power that made faith look like blindfolds. And as the Inquisition withdrew to plan its response, Yhwach watched them go with the patience of a king watching insects scurry to build a wall against the tide. Chaos did not retreat because it was beaten. Chaos retreated because the story had shifted, and stories mattered in the warp. The gods tasted the change immediately. The moment a demon's victory vanished from the possible, the warp rippled. Every cultist who had screamed in ecstasy felt an inexplicable chill. Every sorcerer who had relied on prediction felt his calculations go sour. The universe did not become safer. It became unfamiliar. Yhwach moved from war zone to war zone like an omen. He did not build an army. Armies required loyalty, and loyalty required lies. He did not raise banners. Banners created identity, and identity created rebellion. He simply appeared where the future was cruelest, and he corrected it, not with mercy, but with control. A chaos crusade struck an industrial moon. Its forges turned into slaughterhouses. Demon engines howled through corridors, grinding workers into pulp. The defenders fought with desperation, their prayers rising like sparks in a furnace. Yhwach arrived in a corridor lined with severed pipes and hanging bodies. A demon engine charged him, metal and flesh fused into a nightmare locomotive, cannon mouth glowing. In most futures, it fired and erased him. Yhwach allowed the future, where its ammunition feed jammed for half a second. The cannon coughed instead of roared. The demon engine hesitated, confused by its own failure. That was enough. Yhwach walked forward. The engine's legs buckled as the futures where it maintained balance were denied. It crashed into the wall, screaming in a voice that was part machine, part pleading. Then it unraveled into smoke, its existence rejected by the timeline Yhwach permitted. The defenders watched, stunned. Chaos warriors watched, furious. A champion of chaos stepped forward, armor etched with blasphemies, eyes burning with devotion. He raised his axe and shouted a name that was not a name, but a prayer to violence. He swung. Yhwach saw the swing, saw the 1,000 futures where it connected, and chose the one where the champion's foot slipped on a slick of blood. The axe cut empty air. The champion stumbled, and in that stumble his momentum became his betrayal. Yhwach did not strike him. He simply stood there while the champion fell, and in the futures where the champion rose again, the rise never completed. His heart stopped. His devotion became irrelevant. His gods did not answer quickly enough, because answering required a future where they still controlled the outcome. They did not. Word traveled through the warp like a disease, a being in real space who denied victories, a presence that did not banish demons by faith, but by refusing to allow them a timeline where they won, a rival who treated chaos not as sacred terror, but as a pattern to be mastered. Scene T was the first to truly pay attention. It sent agents, sorcerers, and demon heralds, each one a different attempt to map Yhwach, to predict his behavior, to trap him in a narrative where he could be outplayed. But prediction relied on uncertainty. It relied on the target being vulnerable to surprise. Yhwach's existence made surprise expensive. A coven of chaos sorcerers on a dead world prepared a ritual. They carved runes into their own skin, bled into a circle, and called to the warp for a storm strong enough to swallow Yhwach. They believed their faith would empower their spell. They believed their suffering would purchase them a miracle. The ritual opened. A vortex formed, screaming, and for a moment even Yhwach's futures blurred, because the warp was reaching through. Then Yhwach selected the future, where one sorcerer mispronounced a syllable, a tiny flaw born from exhaustion and fear. The vortex shuddered. The warp, always hungry for mistakes, seized the flaw and widened it. The ritual collapsed inward. The sorcerers were dragged, screaming, into the hole they had opened, their bodies turning into symbols before they vanished. The vortex snapped shut like a mouth. Chaos had attempted to weaponize inevitability. Yhwach had weaponized a single imperfect breath. Nurgle tried next, not with cleverness, but with patience. Plagues began to follow Yhwach's wake. Rot bloomed on worlds he visited. The god of decay believed it could outlast him. After all, everything decayed eventually. Yhwach watched a city succumb to sickness, citizens coughing blood, hospitals overflowing. He did not heal them. Healing was kindness. Kindness was a bargain. He was not there to comfort. He was there to choose. He found the future where the plague mutated into a dead end, a variant that could not spread. He found the narrow outcome where the infection burned itself out, not through medicine, but through the simple fact that the chain of transmission broke at the right moments. In the chosen future, a single carrier died alone in an alley instead of boarding a transport. 1,000 lives turned because of that one unboarded step. The plague slowed, then stopped. Nurgle's laughter faded into irritation because decay had been denied its inevitability. Khorne tried in the only way it knew. It sent war. On a battlefield of shattered rock and burning tanks, a chaos warband charged, screaming for blood. The sky rained ash. The ground shook with heavy footsteps. The warband believed in the honest language of violence. They believed that if they struck hard enough, reality would admit their supremacy. They found Yhwach standing alone. They charged. And then their charge became a tangle of accidents. A boot snagged on wire. A bolter jammed. A grenade detonated too early. A chain blade caught on armor. Tiny failures, mundane, humiliating, each one insignificant alone, together forming a wall. Yhwach did not kill them with power. He killed them by denying them a clean moment. One by one they fell, not because he was faster, but because the future where they succeeded was never allowed to exist. Their faith in violence became useless when violence could not complete its sentence. Slaanesh watched with a different hunger. It did not send only monsters. It sent whispers. Cults offering worship, offering adoration, offering the kind of devotion that turns kings into gods. Yhwach ignored them. He had no interest in being loved. Love was another chain. The Imperium was built on love for a corpse. Chaos was built on love for storms. Both were lies that kept the galaxy sick. But the Chaos gods, in their own twisted intelligence, realized something through all these failures. This was not a pawn. A pawn could be corrupted, tempted, redirected. This was a rival. In the warp, the gods gathered their attention like knives drawing together. Czent, angered and delighted, because a rival meant a game worth playing. Nurgle, amused but unsettled, because a rival meant even rot could be denied. Khorne, furious, because a rival meant war could be made meaningless. Slaanesh, curious, because a rival meant a new flavor of obsession. And in that gathering, a terrifying truth took shape. Yhwach did not fight chaos on its terms. He did not attack the gods directly, because direct attack was a story chaos could absorb. He attacked the only thing that made chaos eternal. He attacked its certainty that it could always surprise, always corrupt, always win somewhere. He was teaching the warp a new lesson. There are futures you are not allowed to have. Across the galaxy, in hidden shrines and worship chapels, men felt the shift without understanding. Prophets faltered. Demon princes hesitated. Sorcerers woke from visions with cold sweat, because they had dreamed of a tomorrow where their gods were not in control. And the gods, those titanic storms, leaned harder against the veil of reality, trying to find an angle, any angle, where they could make this interloper bleed. They would find one. Not because Yhwach was weak, but because the galaxy itself was built to punish certainty. The Imperium sent its answer in ceramite and scripture. Grey Knights. They arrived without fanfare, because fanfare was for armies that needed morale. These warriors needed only purpose. Their strike cruiser slipped into orbit like a knife sliding into flesh. No banners, no broadcast, only a silent descent and the heavy promise of sanctioned violence. When they landed, the ground seemed to flinch. Their armor was etched with wards and prayers, each line a denial of the warp. They were not merely soldiers, they were weapons designed to kill what should not exist. They sought Yhwach the way a blade seeks a throat. Yhwach met them on the edge of a ruined manufactorum, where machinery lay like skeletons, and the air smelled of ozone and old fire. He stood alone, calm, the same stillness that had unsettled demons now meeting the gaze of mankind's most fanatical defenders. The Grey Knights formed a semicircle. Their leader stepped forward, helm shaped like a knightly death mask, eyes glowing behind lenses like cold stars. In the name of the Emperor, you will be judged. Yhwach's reply was quiet. I have already seen your judgment. The leader raised his force weapon, a blade humming with psychic power. The others followed, weapons leveling, storm bolters locking onto him. The air tightened. Psychic wards flared. The Grey Knights began their litanies, words that were not just prayers but weapons, structured sound, designed to cut through warp influence. They believed in faith as armor. Yhwach believed in foresight as law. The leader struck first, moving with transhuman speed, blade carving a line through the air that should have ended Yhwach in a single stroke. In 100 futures, the blade landed. Yhwach chose the one where the leader's footing was half a centimeter off. The blade passed close enough to disturb his cloak, but it did not touch him. The leader's eyes widened behind his helm, not in fear, but in disbelief. Grey Knights did not miss. They were built not to miss. Yhwach moved, not fast, simply correct. He stepped into the gap created by the mist swing and lifted a hand toward the leader's chest. The gesture looked almost gentle. The future where the leader countered did not occur. The leader staggered backward, as if struck by an invisible hammer. His armor did not crack, but his momentum failed. He fell to one knee, weapons scraping against broken concrete. The Grey Knights reacted instantly, firing. Bolter shells screamed through the air, explosive rounds designed to shred flesh and break bone. In the futures where they hit, Yhwach became a red mist. Yhwach selected the future where the first shell struck a dangling cable instead of his skull. The cable snapped, whipping across the firing line. The split second of distraction changed angles. The next shells hammered into rubble, detonating in sprays of dust and shrapnel. The Grey Knights adjusted, their discipline flawless. Yhwach did not allow them the time. He walked forward through the gunfire as if it were rain. Each shell that should have hit him instead found a different destiny, deflected by tiny events that felt like accidents to the Marines. A fragment of stone shifting under a boot, a weapon's recoil pattern altered by a heartbeat, a micro-hesitation born from the creeping realization that something was wrong with the rules. The Grey Knights switched tactics. They advanced, forming a tightening formation, blades raised, psychic energy building like a storm. If bullets could not find him, then they would cut him with certainty. Their leader rose, anger sharpening his voice. Witch, demon, heretic. Yhwach's eyes remained calm. You do not know what those words mean, he said. You use them to avoid thinking. The leader roared and charged again, faster, stronger, the force blade crackling with power that could tear a soul from its body. The Grey Knights followed, a coordinated assault that would have annihilated armies. To Yhwach, it was a pattern. He opened the Almighty wider, and the battlefield became a web of outcomes. He saw every footstep they would take, every feint, every prayer, every angle of attack. Then he began to erase, not their lives, their successes. A Grey Knight swung from the left. In the chosen future, his blade caught on a jut of metal for a fraction of a second. His swing slowed. Another Grey Knight lunged from the right, but his boot landed on loose gravel and slipped. A third raised his weapon to strike from above, but his arm met the leader's shoulder in the tight formation, disrupting the blow. Perfect discipline became a liability when the future itself refused to cooperate. The Grey Knights were not afraid of death. They were afraid of corruption. They were trained to fight the warp by refusing its temptations. But Yhwach was not tempting them. He was making them irrelevant. The leader finally landed a strike, the blade grazing Yhwach's shoulder. It should have carved through him. Instead, the blade met a future where the strike did not have enough conviction. The leader's own disbelief weakened him. The tiniest fracture in certainty, and the warp, always eager to exploit weakness, distorted the force field around the blade. The strike slid off. The leader froze for a breath. That breath was fatal. Yhwach lifted his hand again. This time he did not touch the leader. He touched the future around the leader. He selected the outcome where the leader's heart stuttered once, a momentary arrhythmia triggered by exertion and shock, a momentary failure. The leader collapsed. The Grey Knights stopped, not because they were beaten, but because their narrative had broken. They had been sent to confront a demon or a rogue psyker or a Xeno's threat. They had been sent to fight an enemy that could be killed. They had not been sent to fight inevitability. One Grey Knight raised his stormbolter again, trembling with controlled fury. In the name of the Emperor, you will not defy us. Yhwach looked at him with something almost like pity, not for the man, but for the belief behind him. Your Emperor cannot protect you from the future, he said. He can only teach you to die beautifully in ignorance. The Grey Knight fired. The shell detonated in mid-air, not because of a shield, but because the future where it reached Yhwach was denied. Silence spread across the ruined manufactorum, heavy and unnatural. The surviving Grey Knights withdrew, not in panic, but in disciplined retreat, carrying their fallen leader. They did not speak. They did not pray aloud. Their minds were too busy trying to force the event into a category their training could accept. Yhwach watched them go. He had not slain them all. He could have, but killing them would have been easy, and easy victories taught nothing. He wanted the Imperium to understand. If you send faith against foresight, faith will bleed first. The Imperium could tolerate many horrors. It could tolerate planets falling to chaos, because planets were currency. It could tolerate billions dying, because billions were common. It could tolerate inquisitors disappearing, because secrets were dangerous and disappearance could be explained away. What it could not tolerate was a power it could not threaten. In the dark chambers of orbiting ships, beneath banners stitched with sacred oaths, the decision was made with cold efficiency. Exterminatus. a word that meant the Imperium had stopped trying to correct a problem and had begun to erase it. A final sanction, a ritual of annihilation, delivered with the same solemnity as prayer. The Inquisitor who ordered it did not feel hatred. He felt duty. That was the Imperium's most terrifying trait. It could commit atrocities without emotion, because it believed emotion was weakness. The order traveled through command channels like a death sentence, written in scripture. Warships aligned. Weapons crews prepared cyclonic torpedoes. Priests blessed the launch tubes, mouths chanting litanies over the machinery, as if holiness could justify genocide. On the surface, civilians still whispered Yhwach's name, like a secret. Soldiers still told stories of the silent king who had ended a siege. Fear and gratitude braided together until they became devotion. Devotion is fuel. The warp tasted it, and Yhwach, standing in the ruins of the same broken cathedral, felt the future tighten. He opened the Almighty and saw the Imperium's decision before the torpedoes were launched. He saw the chain of steps, the ritual, the coordinates, the launch sequence. He saw the torpedoes punching into the atmosphere like falling judgments. He saw the planet's crust cracking, the firestorm blooming, oceans boiling, cities turning to glass. He saw billions dying without even understanding why. In most futures, the Imperium succeeded, because Exterminatus was designed to be simple. No battle, no negotiation, no chance for an enemy to adapt, just fire. Yhwach looked up at the ash-grey sky and listened to the distant thunder of ships moving in orbit. He did not panic. Panic belonged to those trapped by events. He allowed the order. He allowed the preparations. He allowed the ritual words to be spoken. Because if he stopped them too early, the Imperium would simply try again with greater force, greater secrecy, greater cruelty. The galaxy would learn the wrong lesson. He wanted it to learn the right one, that even the Imperium's ultimate sanction could be made obsolete. In orbit, a cyclonic torpedo slid into a launch tube. Machine spirits hummed. Priests pressed incense burners to the metal, whispering to the weapon as if it were a saint. A commander called out the sequence. Hands moved. Red runes flashed green. Launch. The torpedo fired, a spear of annihilation dropping toward the planet. On the surface, civilians looked up and screamed as the sky briefly glowed, a falling star too bright, too fast. Soldiers raised weapons uselessly, as if bullets could stop a planet killer. Priests fell to their knees, pleading, not to be spared, but for their deaths to have meaning. Yhwach watched the torpedo descend in a dozen futures at once. Then he selected the one where it did not function. Not through magic, not through a dramatic shield, through something smaller, more humiliating. A microscopic flaw in the detonation sequence, a single corrupted data rune, a fraction of machine code altered by the warp's interference, or by a fatigued adept's hand, or by pure chance. In the chosen future, the torpedo's ignition stuttered. It did not detonate properly. It did not crack the crust. It burned out in the upper atmosphere, breaking apart into molten fragments that rained like brief meteors across the sky. The planet lived. In orbit, silence struck the bridge crews like a slap. Weapons officers stared at their consoles. Priests screamed prayers, accusing the machine spirits of betrayal. The Inquisitor's face hardened into something like horror, because horror is what you feel when the ultimate weapon fails. They launched a second. Yhwach allowed it, because one failure could be dismissed as malfunction. The second torpedo fell. The sky lit again. The world held its breath. Yhwach selected the future, where a defense laser, long thought destroyed, fired at the exact moment the torpedo entered range. Not because anyone ordered it, because a half-functioning cogitator, left in a ruined bunker, cycled through old protocols and chose to do its job. The laser struck. The torpedo exploded harmlessly in the high sky, a bloom of fire that did not touch the ground. 2 failures. Now it was a pattern. On the surface, soldiers who had been ready to die stared upward in stunned disbelief. Civilians wept. Some laughed. Others looked at Yhwach as if he were the only stable object in a collapsing universe. The priests declared it a miracle, then corrected themselves mid-breath, because miracles belong to the Emperor. Their tongues stumbled over doctrine. In orbit, the Inquisitor clenched his fists. This is impossible. Yhwach's voice, carried not by vox but by certainty, was quiet in the minds of those who listened. You built your empire on the belief that annihilation is control, he said. It is not. It is only desperation. The Inquisitor ordered a third launch, but now the crews hesitated, not from disloyalty, but from fear. Fear that their god Emperor's ultimate sanction had been rendered meaningless by an unknown king. That hesitation mattered, because in the futures where they hesitated, the sequence delayed, and in the delay, the fleet became vulnerable to another truth. Chaos was watching. Warp storms thickened around the planet, drawn by the intensity of fear and devotion. Demons gathered in the immaterial, eager to feast on panic. The Imperium had tried to burn a problem away, and instead it had created a beacon. Yhwach opened the Almighty and saw the outcome. The Imperium, the warp, does not forgive embarrassment. It remembers it the way a predator remembers the scent of blood. When Yhwach denied Exterminatus, the shock traveled backward through the immaterial, rippling across cult dreams and demon hierarchies, reaching the great storms that called themselves gods. Khorne felt it as insult. Nurgle felt it as irritation. Slaanesh felt it as fascination. Sange felt it as a problem that needed to be solved, not with force, but with narrative, because the warp is a story engine. It runs on meaning. It feeds on belief. And Yhwach had just proven he could edit the ending. So the gods responded, not with whispers this time, with pressure, with a tightening of currents around the worlds that had heard his name. Warp storms thickened like bruises across the void. Astropaths screamed themselves blind. Navigators saw impossible constellations. Ships drifted off course, dragged into screaming color. The gods were not striking at Yhwach alone. They were striking at the idea that a single will could dominate them. On the surface of a besieged world, the sky tore open again, a wound of violet and sickly green, of brass glare and sensual dark. Demon lords poured through in shapes large enough to blot out the sun, their forms anchored by the fear of billions. Imperial defenders fell back, weapons shaking. Priests screamed prayers until their throats bled. The air tasted like metal and incense. Everyone waited for the inevitable. Everyone believed this was the end. Then Yhwach stepped toward the rift. He did not leap like a hero. He walked like a judge approaching a courtroom. The ground cracked beneath his calm, not from force, but from the subtle strain of reality trying to reconcile his presence with its own rules. At the edge of the wound, he opened the Almighty, and for a moment, the world around him slowed. Not time itself, but the human experience of time. Every scream, every muzzle flash, every falling ash particle became a marker on a map. He stepped into the warp. Inside, the ocean of madness surged to meet him like a living throat. Currents slammed into him with the weight of entire civilizations collapsing. Faces formed and dissolved in the storm. Laughter and sobbing intertwined. A billion prayers, spoken across a galaxy of suffering, became the tides. Yhwach stood within it and did not drown. Demon lords approached, each one a crown piece of a god, each one carrying a concentrated flavor of the storm that birthed it. The first was brass and rage, a towering champion whose armor screamed with chained skulls. Its axe was a sentence that ended in blood. It charged. In the warp, the charge was more than motion. It was declaration. It was the claim that violence always gets the final word. Yhwach looked into the branching futures. Here, the branches were messy. Contradictions piled on contradictions. But rage had patterns, and patterns could be exploited. He chose the future where the demon lord overcommitted by a fraction, where its own hunger to prove dominance made it swing wide. The axe came down and missed. The demon lord did not understand miss. Its identity was impact. The confusion that followed was like a crack in a pillar. The warp, always eager, widened that crack. Yhwach did not strike the demon lord. He denied it the next clean moment. He denied it the dignity of a proper second swing. Its form began to fray, armor dissolving into screaming symbols, skulls falling away like rotten fruit, rage dispersing into the current. It vanished, banished, not by strength, but by the absence of a future where it could finish what it started. Khorne answered with more pressure. The ocean roared. Then came rot. A bloated lord of Nurgle drifted in, smiling as if this were a reunion. Its presence made the currents viscous. Disease became perfume. Despair became lullaby. It spoke with a voice like damp earth. Everything yields eventually, even kings. It raised a staff and spilled a wave of decay toward Yhwach. Not decay of flesh, but decay of meaning. The insistence that control is temporary, that effort ends in surrender, that everything becomes soft in time. Yhwach opened the Almighty and selected the future, where the decay found no purchase, where the despair it carried met a will that did not accept comfort. The wave washed over him and broke apart like fog against stone. The demon lord's smile faltered. Yhwach spoke, quiet. You offer surrender as kindness. It is not kindness, it is laziness. The demon lord lunged, offended. Its touch promised plague, the kind that would make certainty rot from the inside. Yhwach denied the lunge. The demon lord unraveled in place, collapsing into a puddle of laughing filth that could not hold its shape because its victory had been removed from the possible. Now the warp shifted. The currents became clever. A maze formed around him, not of walls but of outcomes, false futures, glittering, seductive, each one a corridor that led to contradiction. Tzeentch did not attack with claws. Tzeentch tacked with choice. Yhwach saw visions of himself kneeling, visions of himself crowned by feathered wings and endless eyes, visions of himself as a puppet king, believing he ruled while strings pulled at his spine. Tzeentch whispered through the maze, amused, if you see every future, then choose. Choose until you break. The trap was simple. Offer infinite options until certainty collapses under its own weight. Yhwach did not take the bait. He did not need to pick the correct corridor. He needed to deny the maze its purpose. He opened the Almighty wider, accepting the fracture, accepting the overlap, and within the chaos, he found the one constant he trusted, his own will. He selected the future where the maze-maker underestimated him, where the god of schemes assumed he would cling to a perfect path. Yhwach did not cling, he discarded. He refused every corridor that was not authored by him. The maze cracked. Corridors folded into themselves. Possibilities collapsed like paper soaked in oil. The labyrinth became a knot, then a smear, then nothing. Tzeentch's presence recoiled, not wounded, but startled, not because it had lost, but because it had been denied the pleasure of surprise. Then the warp softened. Heat spread through the current like silk. The screaming became almost musical. Colors turned lush and inviting. A presence described itself not as threat, but as intimacy. Slaanesh arrived as sensation. A voice slid into Yhwach, close, almost tender. You carry certainty like a chain. Let it go. Feel. Be held. Be adored. It was not crude lust. It was relief, the promise that he could stop carrying the burden of deciding. For a fraction of a moment, the offer hovered, because even kings can tire. Yhwach denied the future where he listened. The silk snapped into razors. The music became shrieks. The scent turned to iron. Slaanesh withdrew, laughing, because refusal was its own kind of obsession. And behind all of it, the great storms leaned closer, immense, furious, unable to fully manifest without tearing their own realm apart, unable to fully strike him without risking what they were. Yhwach could not kill them. They were too integrated into the galaxy's suffering. They were fed by every prayer, every murder, every hopeless night. But he could do something worse. He could make them unable to surprise him. He stood in the heart of the storm and spoke a decree into the immaterial, a calm statement that sounded like the closing of a door. I will not be corrupted. I will not be outplayed. I will not be surprised. The warp shuddered. Across the galaxy, cult leaders woke from dreams in cold sweat, sensing a silence where there should have been whispers. Demon princes hesitated mid-campaign, suddenly uncertain. Astropaths felt their visions blur. Fear shifted in the minds of men, not away from chaos, towards certainty. He did not claim a throne. That was the first thing the galaxy could not understand. Power here always demanded a seat, a symbol, a ritual. The Emperor had his golden prison on Terra. The Chaos Gods had their endless domains in the warp. Every warlord and saint demanded banners and statues, because authority must be seen to be believed. Yhwach refused it all. He did not build an empire because empires required compromise. They required laws written for people who could not see tomorrow, laws that would be twisted by fear and ignorance. He did not found a cult because worship was another form of chaos, an unpredictable storm that births new gods and new lies. Instead, he became a wandering sovereign of destiny. He appeared where fate was most cruel, not always where the battle was loudest, but where the future was most diseased. A hive city choking on famine and gang war, a frontier world on the edge of a warp breach, a void station where an inquisitor prepared to purge an entire population for the sin of panic. He did not always save them. He did not always spare them. Mercy was not his nature. Control was. On worlds where chaos would have triumphed, he denied the triumph. He erased the narrow chain of events that produced victory and watched demon armies unravel like smoke. On worlds where the Imperium would have committed atrocities in the name of purity, he sometimes denied the atrocity, not out of kindness, but out of efficiency. Mass murder created fear. Fear fed the warp. The Imperium, in its desperation, strengthened the very nightmare it claimed to fight. To the Imperium, he became a problem without a name. They called him heretic because heresy could be hunted. They called him witch because witches could be burned. They called him demon because demons could be exorcised. They called him Xenos because Xenos could be exterminated. None of the words fit, because Yhwach did not demand rebellion. He did not whisper sedition. He did not offer pleasure or liberation. He offered correction. Survivors would gather in ruins and ask what he was. A saint, a monster, an angel. Lee. Yhwach did not answer. Answers created stories. Stories created belief. Belief created gods. He had seen what gods did to this galaxy. The Emperor had become a prison of doctrine. Chaos had become a prison of indulgence, rage, despair, and ambition. Different masks, same sickness. A universe addicted to worship. Yhwach did not want to replace those gods. He wanted to end the need for them. That was why the Imperium feared him more than chaos. Chaos could be fought. Chaos could be preached against. Chaos could be contained with rituals and crusades and sacrifice. But a being who made the Imperium's sacrifices meaningless threatened the foundation of their faith. Inquisitors plotted in secret. Grey Knights prepared deeper rites. The High Lords argued behind locked doors, terrified of admitting that the Emperor's light was not the only certainty in the dark. And chaos, for all its hunger, learned to avoid the places where Yhwach's shadow fell, not because it was weaker, but because it could not play its favorite game there. It could not surprise. Yhwach drifted through the galaxy like a cold star, pulling futures into alignment where he walked. To those he spared, he was salvation without warmth. To those he condemned, he was execution without hatred. On quiet nights, on worlds too small to matter, he would stand beneath unfamiliar constellations and feel the warp watching. He would feel the gods waiting, learning. He would feel the Imperium turning its vast machinery, preparing, praying, fearing. He did not flinch. He had been cast into a universe that worshipped inevitability while drowning in contradiction. A universe where men called obedience holy and called fear faith. And yet, he remained what he had always been. A king who believed the cosmos was sick. A king who believed freedom was a lie told by the blind. A king who looked at war, gods, empire, and despair and saw only a broken machine that needed one cure: absolute control